guys, love your heart, love what's happening here. I know deep down what you're really wondering, though, because you have a fantasy team. I know the Pee Wee Skyhawks Escalon team won 6-0 today. So get that off your mind. You guys can be focused now on what we're going to talk about. Hey, I think this goes without saying, but Remy melted some faces today, didn't he? He just melted some faces. A couple of things that stuck out from what he said. He said, without light, there is no life. I love that, right? Without light, there is no life. He also said that there's nothing weak about being a Christian. I'd like to know that. He also said this. He says, it takes more strength to love someone than to punch him in the face. I really like that too. That's good to know. That's good to know. But listen, those were good words for us to kind of continue as we press forward, as we kind of think about, hey, we left some stuff outside that door. We decided to say our strength is not what we need. God, we have open hands. Fill us with your power. We said we want to make sure we're fighting the right battle at the right time against the right enemy. We said that we really, in order for us to comprehend any of this, we have to understand what Jesus has done for us, the salvation message and what it means to be a Christ follower, that when we follow him, we should do it boldly, we should do it with confidence, we should do these things because our God is not weak, he is strong. And so what we're at is that we come to this night where we have a chance to start to unpack what Paul has been trying to tell us in Ephesians 6. In Ephesians 6, again, we know that Paul is now in a prison. He's writing 4 different letters called the prison epistles to 4 different churches, this one being to this church in Ephesus. And as he's in prison, as he's in bondage, not because he broke the law, but because he was bold in his faith, he looks to his right, he looks to his left, and he sees that he's being guarded by these Roman guards. And as he looks at these Roman guards, he notices what they're wearing. He starts to understand that this is something that should inspire him. In fact, should inspire every Christian in the world. And so in Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 10, we read these words and we'll read them again. It says that finally, be strong in the Lord, in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. So he reiterates this idea that we need to stand our ground, and in verse 14, right after, he says, stand firm then. Stand firm then. See, when you know who your enemy is, it's time to stand firm. But before you can do that, before you can go into battle, you need to know what you're supposed to wear. You need to figure out what you're supposed to wear. Now, when I played baseball, I vividly remember that you would put on your uniform the same way every time, so long as you got a hit. And if not, you change that the next day. You try whatever you had to do, you know? So you would, exactly, right? So you would put on your sliding shorts. If you can't really get around that, you'd have your jock on, then you'd put your left sock in your right sock. You'd lace the belt through because you didn't want to have to do it when you had them on. You'd put them on, you'd buckle up, you'd get your jersey on, your undershirt on, you'd throw your hat on. You would get geared up. I vividly remember that. But the last thing that I always put on was eye black. Right? Just always put on eye black. Number one, because it's messy. Right? It's just a little messy and you don't want to get it all over your whites. The other reason, it was game time. You know, it was game time. And when you put that on, the alter ego of B. Hunt came out. And it was time to go and play some baseball. And now I watch my daughter put it on. Now, it's a little bit different in softball because they put like neon green and all that kind of crazy stuff on. But man, when you put, it was black, right? Black. That was your war paint. Now they smear it all over the face, right? It was your war paint. You were going into battle. You knew it was time to go to war. And when you get dressed every morning, you're getting ready for whatever the day has ahead of you. There's a phrase that says you're supposed to dress for success, right? Dress for success. So are you dressing for what you're expecting that day to bring? Because you would not wear a 3-piece suit to the beach. And you would not wear a white mesh thong to a board meeting, okay? You should never wear a white mesh thong in any circumstance at all, but you would definitely not wear it to a board meeting. I think as men, we're somewhat aware of that. But we are completely clueless on what to wear when it comes to the battle of our souls. So maybe the question that we need to wrestle with this evening is this very simple one. It's this: are we dressing for spiritual success? Are we dressing for spiritual success? But God is telling us, He's saying, stand firm. I want you to get dressed, though. And guess what? He says, I've got an outfit already picked out for you. And it's not a sport coat, it's not loafers, but it is armor, and it has eye black with it. Because you, my friends, are going to get ready to go into battle. Paul's already told us in Ephesians 6:11, he says, put on the full armor of God. So using what's in front of Paul, this inspiration of the Roman guard, Paul takes this Roman guard and he uses it as a prototype for us. Now let me give you a little idea of what Paul's referring here today. To understand the purpose of what the armor is, historically for both the Greek and the Roman soldiers, the full armor had this name. It was called the panoply. The panoply, it was the full thing. It meant a full suit of armor. That's exactly what it meant. The full weight of it was about 66 pounds of armor that was on you, including your food rations. 66 pounds. I think there could maybe be a CrossFit thing that happens with that. 66 pounds of Roman armor. I want to see it. I want to see it. So, and check this out. In my reading, they used to have to provide their own uniforms. Yeah, that's right. It was BYOA. Bring your own armor is what it was. Whatever you brought is what you could put on. And if you lost it or forgot it, you had to replace it. It wasn't until later that they started to issue these and that everyone got the same thing. So until then, your protection for going into battle was based on what you could provide. So some didn't have a coat of mail or a breastplate or anything. And as one scholar said that I read, he says they went in with what they had and hoped for the best. They'd provide their own thing. But guess what? I see this all the time. We so often come into the battle with bedhead, no shirt on, a pocket knife, and we wonder why we're getting our butt kicked all the time in spiritual battle, every day. And I think it's because of three reasons. First reason you might want to write down the reason we get our butts kicked in spiritual battles is this: is one, we underestimate our opponent. We underestimate our opponent. In athletics, there was always that time that we would get the schedule at the beginning of the year, and you look down the line, and you would see the ones that you would almost call, oh, that's a win. And that's a win. Oh, we're going to work them over. No problem there, right? And isn't it funny how sometimes if you kept that same attitude when you played them, they would work you over? Right? Because you underestimated your opponent. You played down to your competition. And so when it comes to our spiritual walk, this is when we start to think that, you know what? This whole spiritual, warfare deal is just a bunch of hippy-dippy baloney. Like, it ain't even real. But when you underestimate your spiritual opponent, you're in for a load of hurt. One of my favorite examples of this is Paul. Paul was preaching and teaching, and we read in the book of Acts about how he was preaching. In fact, he was so filled with the Spirit that, believe it or not, he had these like hankies that he had touched, and people would take them and they would be healed and stuff. Like not Benny Hinn style, but kind of around that, right? It was just crazy thing. It's in the Scripture, Acts 19, starting in verse 11 and 12. You can read about it. But all of a sudden, you saw this happening, and these Jewish people said, "That's kind of cool, man. I think I want to kind of do that." So these Jewish people started to do it. So in verse 13 and 16, check this out, one of the greatest scriptures in all the Bible. It says, some Jews who went around driving out evil spirits tried to invoke the name of the Lord Jesus over those who were demon-possessed. They would say, in the name of Jesus, whom Paul preaches, I command you to come out. 7 sons of Sceva and a Jewish chief priest were doing this. One day, the evil spirit answered them. It says, Jesus, I know. Paul, I know about. Who are you? Then the man who had the evil spirit jumped on them, overpowered them all. He gave them such a beating that they ran out of the house naked and bleeding. If you want to know who wins a fight, it's as if you go in with pants on and you come out without pants and bloody, you lost. Just going to let you know. That's just a good sign that things went really, really bad. So if we underestimate our opponent, we will be poorly prepared, poorly dressed, and poorly represented. We cannot underestimate the opponent that we are up against, because when we do that, we go in with our strength. And when we go into the battle with our strength, we leave naked and bloodied every time. Every time. We underestimate our opponent, number one. Number two is that we overestimate our opponent sometimes. We will overestimate our opponent. Sometimes, y'all, we give Satan so much credit in our lives. We just give him too much credit. We give in, and we feel like we're just innocent victims in this whole thing. So what we do is we roll over, we give in. Just my circumstances, Pastor. It's just there's no way of getting past it. You know what? That was my past. There's no way I can get through that. No way God's going to forgive me of that. You're in the middle of your pain, whatever it might be. You know what? Satan just got me. And so in the middle of this pity party, we forget that Jesus is a warrior. We forget all about that. We forget that we're already on the winning side. We forget all about that. So we underestimate our opponent. We will overestimate our opponent and we'll give in. That's the second reason why sometimes we get our butt kicked. And then the third reason is this, is that we are lazy. We are lazy. If we're just honest. If we're honest with each other, a lot of the reason we don't get dressed like God tells us to do is because we're lazy. We would rather have our wife or our girlfriend take the spiritual lead in the relationship and tell us what we should wear instead of getting our own drawers on ourselves. I see it all the time. All the time. And if they don't do this, and if we don't do this, the other side of it is we'll become spiritually indifferent. We'll say, whatever. Whatever. I'll just figure it out as I go along. I don't really need all this stuff. We'll say things like, you know what? I'm young enough. I got time to figure all this out. I'll just wait a little bit. We'll say, you know, I'm not that bad of a person. What's the big deal? If I get in front of God, I can just tell him why I'm so good. I don't need to worry about all that. Look at all my Instagram followers. He's going to definitely check that out. Or we'll say, I don't really kind of want to work that hard to actually follow God. So you know what? I'll just tap it. Lazy. We underestimate our opponent, we overestimate our opponent, and we are flat out lazy. But I'm telling you, I'm here today to tell you that we cannot afford to be lazy. We can't afford. The battle is real. The stakes are real. And it is vital that we understand how we learn to stand firm in our faith and understand the enemy that we are against. And God does not expect us to go into the battle naked, by the way. He actually says, you know what, I've got some equipment for you and I want to arm you with it. And so as we look a little closer at the armor of God tonight, I want you to remember a couple of things as we kind of dive into this today. The first is that I think it's important to remember and to consider that not all the armor was meant to be worn all the time. Not all the armor was meant to be worn all the time. Some of it was only needed when you were fighting a battle, when you're in the middle of it. And there was times it was just kind of a general uniform. Let me give you an example. Again, I just put on my uniform getting ready for the baseball game. And see, that was what I wore the whole time. Spikes, pants, shirt. You know, that's what I wore all the time. But there was different times in the game that I would do different things. So when I played defense, I had my glove. Or I had my gear on. When I went and played offense, I put my helmet on and I had my bat. So there was different times that I used different things. But the uniform itself kind of stayed the same. The same is true about the armor of God. First three pieces we're going to talk about tonight is what you will wear all the time. Consider it what you should wear every day, every moment of your life. It is the standard uniform. But the other three that we're going to look at are going to be when you use them at the right time in the right place. So I want you to keep that in mind as we look at these tonight. And then the second aspect of the armor I want you to consider is that what the scripture will tell us is that there's three things that we're told to put on and three things that we're told to take up. 3 to put on, 3 to take up. And again, it tells us about we are to put on these certain 3 things, and then we're to take up these other things as we go into battle. But a key distinction that we have to remember is that you and I have to choose to put this on. We have to choose to put it on. It's not like your mom is going to cram your foot on your shoe when you're at the Target trying to get that on anymore. No, you have to choose whether or not you're going to put these on. Whether we choose to do it is up to us. It's 100% up to us. But when we do choose, check this out. We can't pick and choose what parts we want to put on. Okay? It's all or none. Just like my son, when he's at dinner and he doesn't like the vegetables, like there is no thank you bite with the armor of God. Okay? My son gets out of green beans, but we don't get out of some of these things, right? It's all or none. We have to either put it on or we don't put it on at all, because it all fits together and it works together. And so with that understanding, that the armor of God is vital to our spiritual walk, it's required if we have any chance of the battles that we're going into, and that is optional for us to put on. Now and only then can we start to look at the individual pieces of armor to understand what they mean to us. So tonight what we'll do is we'll tackle all 3 of the things that we put on, and we're going to tackle one of the things that we are to take up as Remy brings us home with the last 2 tomorrow. I'll give the Navy SEAL all the fancy stuff, you know what I mean? Right? So what I want us to do, 3 things we put on, 1 thing that we're going to take up. Let's begin today. Ephesians chapter 6, looking at verse 14. Verse 14 says this. It says, "Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist," it says. So the belt of truth is the first thing that we see Paul tell us. And this seems to us like that's a little backwards, BB, isn't it? As a little bit backwards. Why in the world, when we are heading into war, would we would be worried about the belt that we have on? Isn't the first thing we need to get is like a shield, a sword, a bazooka, and like something like that? Isn't that what we need to be more worried about? Why a belt? Well, here's why. Whether or not you have all that other stuff doesn't matter. That if you're in the middle of the battle, your pants fall down. Okay, right? You are no good to anybody when you got pants by the enemy. So we have to consider this. Most scholars will agree that the belt itself, it had an intricate decor, an elaborate buckle with it, and it distinguished someone from a normal civilian and a Roman legion person. And sometimes it wasn't a secondary accessory. It wasn't like you match it with your boots or something. You just wore it all together. And it was a sturdy leather girdle that they would wear. And the reason why is that it wasn't just a piece that you wore. It actually carried the weight of much of the other armor that you would wear. That it would actually help keep the pressure off your shoulders and off your back, because it would actually support some of the weight. Otherwise, if you didn't have the belt, it would wear you down. You wouldn't be as effective in battle. So the belt was very, very important. So what does this belt of truth mean for the armor of God? Well, it means that we must have truth around our waist, because without it, everything else falls down. We must have that. It supports the weight of all the other pieces of armor, spiritual armor, that we'll talk about. My friends, listen to me. Truth in our world is what we call relative truth right now. Relative truth, meaning that what's right for you is right for you, and whatever's true for you can be true for you, but it doesn't have to be true for me. I would even go so far as to say that we live in relative reality. Relative reality. What we want to be true, we just say is truth. What we want to be real, it can be real. But that can't be true. Dave does copy. He's doing good right back there, right? Because listen, there has to be a basis for truth. There cannot be. So if you say what you say is true, and I say what I say is true, so one of us has to be right. So there has to be some overarching truth that is out there, because the idea that there's relative truth, it falls underneath the weight of its own presumptions. There has to be truth that is out there. But why does truth even matter? Because it's the anchor on which everything else is built. It's the anchor of the armor of God, because everything rests on it. Without truth, we have nothing. We have nothing to hold up anything else. So truth is important. And truth matters in your life too. At your job, truth matters with your boss and your coworkers. In your marriage, truth matters. that you're telling each other what is true, so there's trust in your relationship. In parenting, truth matters with our kids, and to have honesty with them. Truth matters. Statistics will tell us, though, that 2/3 of spouses will lie to each other. Statistics also will tell us that 90% of Americans lie on a daily basis. But check this out. 100% of the time, Satan lies. 100% of the time, Satan is lying. So we must root ourselves in the truth of God, not of culture, not of what our friends say, not of what the media says, not of what your cute girlfriend says. We need to understand the truth of God, that the belt of truth is found in God and God alone. And in a world that says there is no absolute truth is the reason that we need truth more than ever before. And in a world that likes to live in a world of loopholes and exceptions to the rule, we have to be careful to know that we need to be vigilant to what is true. We can tell the difference between, so that we can tell the difference between the junk that's in our world. If there is no relative truth, we have nothing to compare it to. The great theologian and pastor Charles Spurgeon once said these very important lines. He says, discernment is not a matter of simply telling the difference between what is right and wrong. Rather, it is the difference between right and almost right. We live in a world of right and almost right. But listen, God doesn't live in the almost right. See, God lives in the right. God lives in the holy. God lives in the truth. We must be rooted in the truth of God, or else we can't put on anything else. We cannot put on anything else because it all hinges on what is true. That is the foundation for it all. And only after we add that can we add the other pieces of the armor. Which brings us to the second thing. The second piece of armor is in Ephesians 16, the rest of that, verse 14. It says, with the breastplate of righteousness in place. The breastplate of righteousness. Now, underneath the breastplate, some of the people, if they could afford it, would have what's called, it was called a mail armor. A mail armor. It was these iron rings about 7 millimeters in diameter, and they would kind of lock together, and then they would be placed onto a backing, and then the breastplate would be placed over the top of it. The Greek word for the breastplate is thoraka, and since it was designed to cover the thorax, so it would be from the belt all the way to the thorax. And what's interesting is that the breastplate was designed to guard your heart. To guard your heart. It was designed to keep out those things that would instantly kill you if it ever got to your heart. And if we remember the belt of truth, it was connected to the righteousness. The righteousness would rest on the belt. They were interconnected, which means this, that without truth, you are unable to connect what is right from what is wrong. It's impossible. So as we live our lives and we place ourselves in these battlefields against the enemy that we're up against, the right thing to do, the righteous thing to do is rooted in the truth of God. And why the breastplate of righteousness is so important is because it guards our heart. And guys, our heart is important. King Solomon would say this in Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Our heart is important. And you know that. Because some of you have had your heart broken, maybe in a relationship. Some of you have followed your heart and it hasn't really ended up all that good. Some of you know that your emotions come from your heart and it hurts when people say things or do things or don't do things. You see, your heart matters. But guess what? Your heart will also fail you too. It'll fail you. Psalm 73:26 says, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? So what does this mean? What does this whole heart discussion mean? It means that we have to be very careful about our hearts when it comes to our life. Because if our heart isn't anchored in the truth of God, it becomes untethered to the godly reality it was meant to have. And this is where our worldviews begin to deviate from the way that we follow our hearts. When we follow our hearts instead of God, we get in trouble. And what we think is righteous becomes unrighteous because we have unhitched it from the post that it was meant to be tied to from the beginning. Now, I grew up, my dad was a golf pro back in South Dakota. And so we spent lots of days at the pro shop, okay? And we used to pick range balls on the range. And my dad was cheap, and he would never get one of those carts that would like roll it up for you, you know, and kind of put the balls in around the range, because that's why he had 3 boys. So us 3 boys, we got those hand pickers, you know what I'm saying? Like this one at a time, across like 2 acres of land, right? We're doing it. And we got a whole $1 for every 60-gallon bucket we filled. You know, we thought it was the greatest thing ever, right? But since we hung around at the pro shop so much, there was oftentimes things that would happen, just kind of crazy things, and, you know, drunk guys coming in off the range and all kinds of stuff. It was crazy stuff like that. But occasionally, you would hear somebody say, "There goes another one!" And what that meant was that a golf cart had, like, the accelerator had stuck down, and it was, like, on the run. You know, there goes another one. All of a sudden, you'd see this, like driverless cart just go right in front of you, you know? And you'd wait for it to hit something and stop, you know? But what's interesting about that is that it might have looked like a golf cart, but it had stopped being a golf cart. It now was a torpedo that was going to kill someone. The intended right reason for the golf cart got changed because of what it was actually doing. So we have to understand that. We need to remember that things can become unrighteous if they become unhitched to what they were supposed to be doing in the first place. I love what Priscilla Shirer says about this. She says that when you and I choose not to align our actions with God's truth, when we live in blatant rebellion against His will for us, we leave our heart exposed where Satan can take a clear shot. Guys, there's a lot of us in this room with unprotected hearts that Satan has a clear shot at right now. You've taken your breastplate down. And because of that, you're starting to think that, you know, whatever my girlfriend thinks, that's what is most important to me. That's what's right. Because frankly, I don't want to lose her. And so instead of standing up for what's right, I bend my knee to whatever she says so that I don't have to be alone. And we'll listen to her and whatever crazy ideology she has so we can stay together forever. Or because of that, when we have our breastplate down, we start to think that what people might say at work becomes bigger than what our faith actually tells us. And so we're more worried about our jobs and our commission than we are about what Jesus tells us. And because what you see on the internet and the news is so prevalent, all of a sudden, with your breastplate down, your heart starts to get changed, and you start to think, well, that guy seems pretty smart, so maybe he is right, instead of going through the truth of what God says is true. When your breastplate of righteousness comes off, your heart is exposed to all kinds of things. And Satan has a clear shot at it. So we must just keep the breastplate of righteousness on, because it's the only way that we'll know what's right from wrong. If we have that on, securely hooked to the belt of truth. So what this means practically is that when we choose to root ourselves in Jesus, when we are rooting ourselves in the truth, and that then becomes the filter that we push our entire life through. That we don't worry about what our girlfriend says. We don't worry about our job says. We don't care what the internet says. We care what Jesus says. We filter it through that, and that becomes right, and that becomes wrong. So that means that when something happens in our world that doesn't make our heart feel right, we don't freak out. What we do is we press it through, not of our emotions, but we press it through Jesus. And so we must protect our hearts from being overwhelmed by all the garbage that's in our world. And once we have our belt right, once we have the breastplate on, we're ready for the next piece of armor, which is this. And it says, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. The gospel of peace. There's different shoes for different occasions, aren't there? And I remember when I played basketball growing up, my mama would buy us basketball shoes. Anybody else get some basketball shoes growing up, you know? Anybody Reebok pumps? Remember some Reebok pumps, you know? How about the David Robinsons? Remember those bad boys came up like right here? You'd have to pump them up, you know what I'm saying? You know, LA Gear had the knockoffs. You got like 2 pumps and go like blow up, you know what I'm talking about? Basketball shoes. But what was the one rule about basketball shoes? You can only wear your basketball shoes on the right. That was it, right? There was no option. Your mama saw you with those wearing them at school, you are dead. You are dead, right? Because they're basketball shoes. Different shoes for different occasions that you're supposed to wear. God says, I got some shoes I need you to wear. During the Roman time, it was interesting. Civilians used to wear these leather shoes called calceas. And then they had these indoor shoes, which are slippers. They were called soleas. But when soldiers they had these military sandals, and they were called caliga. And they were kind of half boot and half sandal. You'd lace them up a little bit higher. They had kind of these cool designs on them, and they were kind of open for ventilation so that you could ventilate them a little bit. But one interesting part about them that distinguished them from anything else was they had these they're called hobnails that would stick out the bottom of them. They basically were like cleats, okay? They were the first cleats. And the interesting part about that, they were designed that way so that when you were in battle, you could get your feet stuck in the ground and you could stand firm. And the way that they would align the battles is they would line the men up shoulder to shoulder, and they would all be right there standing firm together. And there was strength in numbers there. There was strength in numbers. But the interesting part is if one of them started to tip, the whole line would tip because they were in it together. And what's interesting about that is that the shoes were so important for them because it was part of their whole army, their whole armor. It was one of the most important things. But the shoes were not just a fashion accessory. They carried a very important thing. And they weren't just to stand firm, because shoes are made for action. Shoes are made to move forward. Shoes are put on to get moving. That's why you have shoes on. And when I was reading this, I couldn't help but remember that one of my favorite memories and the things that it's impressed in me is when we used to get ready to go out onto the field in baseball, and all of us would be ready, and we'd go down the tunnel together, and you would hear that click, 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 click of all the cleats, right? Like 30 of us just coming down. You hear the, right? Now imagine this, if you will. An entire army, a Roman legion of army, all walking on this ground together. And you would hear this sound coming, and the enemy would know, y'all, they're coming. And you hear this click, click, click of thousands and thousands of men getting ready to stand firm and go into battle. They were warriors going into battle together. See, sometimes we think of these Roman legions as gladiators. The gladiators in Roman legion were different. Gladiators were one-on-one in an arena with a sword, and one man came out and one man didn't. But soldiers were different because they fought as a unit. They would stand firm together. They would click down together. They would be ready to go together. They were gladiators, but they were soldiers together. But let's not lose sight of what they were marching to. These shoes were called the shoes of peace. Peace. Sometimes I think as men, we lose sight of that. And we like to mess things up more than calm them down. Ask any one of our wives when we come home and hang out with the kids. Am I right? Right, we get them all wild up, and our wives are like, what are you doing? You know, I had them ready for bed, and now they're crazy. But listen, as we consider our enemy, we have to know that Satan hates peace. He hates peace. Again, quoting Priscilla Schreier, she says, of all the things the enemy seeks to steal, kill, and destroy in your life is peace. Peace is almost always near the top of the list. He is the Lord of chaos and confusion. Men, we need to be called men of peace. We fight not to pillage villages to get whatever we can. Remember, we talked about that. No, we come in with peace. One of the greatest ways that Satan will attack and get rid of peace, did you know this, is in our homes. He loves it. That's when all of a sudden you feel like your wife has turned on you, and all of a sudden she's the enemy in your home. You feel like your kids are up against you. He'll even turn extended families on each other because he's the author of chaos and confusion. And he only wants to write mayhem into your homes and on the pages of your life. He doesn't want peace in your homes. And my friends, it is time that we as men put on the armor of God, stand firm, and bring peace into our homes. We should not be the ones running the other direction away. We should be the ones standing firm and saying, let's bring peace to our home. Let's be men of valor and honor. We must be the ones that choose to do things differently than how they've always been done. We must choose to put on the shoes of peace in order for there ever to be a chance in our world. So these are three things that we need to put on, that we choose to put on as believers in Jesus. We put on the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, and we put on the shoes of peace. But before we go on to the next thing, I think we need to understand something. See, Paul wasn't just creating this image of this armor of God, just out of this Roman soldier guarding him in prison. No. I told you yesterday that Paul was an interesting man because he actually was somebody that hated Christians. He hated Christians because he was under the teaching of this guy by the name of Gamaliel. And remember, he actually memorized the Old Testament as part of his training. He was so in tune with what the Jews believed in the Old Testament, he had made it part of who he was. And so as a part of that training, he would have also memorized a very important passage of Scripture. In Isaiah chapter 59. In Isaiah 59, we read these words about the people of Israel. And they had forsaken God, and they were worshiping idols, and God was just completely beyond himself. These people had started to choose to run away from him instead of to him. And so we read in Isaiah 59, starting in verse 12, "For our offenses are many in your sight, and our sins testify against us. Our offenses are ever with us, and we acknowledge our iniquities. Rebellion and treachery against the Lord, turning our backs on our God, inciting revolt and oppression, uttering lies our hearts have conceived. So justice is driven back and righteousness stands at a distance. Truth has stumbled in the streets. Honesty cannot enter. Truth is nowhere to be found, and whoever shuns evil becomes prey." The people had lost their minds. They had lost their mind, they had lost sight of God. They had started to do their own things, worship their own things, do it their own way. Does this sound anything similar to what's happening in our world? All of a sudden, thousands of years ago, slams right into where we're at right now. But this is where we get to read, where it says this. It says, "The Lord looked and was displeased that there was no justice. He saw that there was no one, he saw that there was no one. He was appalled that there was no one to intervene. So his own arm achieved salvation for him, and his own righteousness sustained him. He put on righteousness as his breastplate, and the helmet of salvation on his head. He put on the garments of vengeance and wrapped himself in zeal as in a cloak." My friends, this should blow your mind right now. Because listen to what I'm about to tell you. That thousands of years before Paul would ever be in that prison, thousands of years before he'd ever see a Roman guard, there was a group of people sinning, and they were going against God, and they were doing terrible things. All of these things were happening. And what is so amazing is that we see God see all of this happen, and what he does is he goes into battle and he puts on armor to be able to go and become what they call the divine warrior, is what this is called. So my friends, let this seep into your brain right now. That when God says put on the armor of God, you're not putting on your armor. You're putting on God's armor. It's God's armor. You're not at the playing against sports. You are putting on the creator of the universes. Belts of truth, breastplate of righteousness. You are putting on his sandals of peace, his helmet of salvation, the truth. All of it is coming back because it's the divine warriors. Jesus tells us in Luke 12:35, he says, "Be dressed, ready for service, and keep your lamps burning." Peter tells us, he says to be ready at all times in 1 Peter 1:13. "Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming." Jesus is saying, be ready, and be ready to put on my dad's armor when it is time. And you put on my dad's armor, so put it on. Don't wait. Put on the belt. Put on the breastplate. Put on the shoes. Put them on because you are wearing the very pieces of the divine warrior on your body. That when you go to battle, you don't go alone. You go with God's armor on you. So you can walk in there proud and tall knowing that you have your daddy's clothes on. And it is a good day to be in battle when that happens. And understand this though, that those three things that we just talked about, those are things you should wear all the time. Battle or no battle, you should be truthful, you should be righteous, and you should be there for peace. But then he says there's some things that we should take up. And the first thing he says that we should take up It's found in verse 16 of Ephesians, and it says, in addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. When I think of a shield, nowadays, there's one person that I think of when I think of a shield. Captain America, brother, right? Captain America, right? That dude's off. You throw a shield like a boomerang, comes back to you. Amen? Like, I want that, you know? And then we learned he could throw the Thor hammer. I always knew it. But he could do it, right? You know? But I think of it, right? But here in the text, we see something added to it. Because he's not sporting the star shield, is he? He says, what you are to extinguish, what does it say? The flaming arrows of the evil one. And what's that about? Well, what does that have to do with anything? Now, let's think about this for a second, and I have to give credit to to Pastor Tony Evans, because in listening to this, he said it so brilliantly with this. See, the shield was a defensive thing; it wasn't offensive. Captain America added that later, but this was defensive. And so, why would they be worrying about these fiery arrows? Well, if we bring ourselves to the Western times, and we had cowboys and Indians, remember this. And the cowboys and Indians would fight each other, and usually what would happen is that the cowboys would make a circle with their wagons in the middle. You know that whole phrase, circle your wagons? And the Indians would go around the outside. But the difference was that the Indians had arrows and the cowboys had guns, right? So clearly it's a mismatched fight, if you will. But interestingly enough, as the Indians started to go around, they would shoot these arrows, they would realize that it wasn't as effective until one guy decides to do what? He takes his arrow, he dips it in some kerosene, he lights it on fire. And then he shoots it, but he doesn't shoot it into the wagon, he shoots it on top of the wagon to be able to set it on fire. Because now what the cowboys have to do is they have to deal with two things at once. Arrows coming at them and fire over top of them. It was a distraction. With these fiery arrows that he's talking about, he says, listen, we're going to extinguish every fiery distraction that comes your way with the shield of faith. But what's interesting about these shields that you might not consider is that they weren't meant to be completely used alone. The most effective use of a shield is when you have your brothers standing firm with their shields next to each other, and you create a wall of a defense. So it doesn't matter if it's coming from the top or the side, your brother standing arm in arm help to defend those fiery arrows from ever getting close to you. But oh, too often, Christian men, don't we walk into battle by ourselves? We walk into battle by ourselves and we think, I got this. I'm doing just fine. And then all of a sudden, you're circled up by the enemy, and you don't know what to do.
As they mature, young males begin to explore the boundaries of the pride's territory. Red has ventured out alone. And blundered straight into the middle of the hyena clan. He's trapped by over 20 of them. The pack tries to wear him down. This number of hyenas could kill him. It's impossible to fight them all at once. He can't keep them at bay for much longer. He's tiring fast. His ally, Tartu, has heard the commotion. Now the odds have changed. Even for 20 hyenas, a pair of male lions is too much to take on. Red is lucky.
You were never meant to fight alone. You were never meant to fight alone. And when you do, you will be exhausted. You will get beat down and you will be encircled by the enemy, and he will laugh at you. He will laugh at you because he knows that this is not how God designed you. And when you go against God's design, you are sinning and you're falling right into Satan's hands. But my friends, what happens when you have a brother that comes alongside you? Did you know that they were still outnumbered 10-1? 10-1. But when two of them were together, they ran in fear. The enemy knows that there is strength in numbers. The enemy knows that we are never meant to be alone. And the enemy knows that when we stand firm together, that there is nothing that we can't overcome with the armor of God in place. There's nothing that we can't. So what would it look like, men of God, if we roared together for once in our life? What would our families look like if we were together in them? What would it look like if our cities knew that there was a pack of lions coming down the hill, ready to impact the world for Jesus, because they now are, they can hear us coming, because they hear the clickety-click coming down the hill, because they're ready for battle. And we're tired of the status quo, and we're tired of our families failing, and we're tired of feeling like we're nothing, and we're tired of seeing churches close, and we're tired of all of it. We want men of God to stand up and say, we got you, we're here, we're ready to fight. I got my daddy's armor on, I'm ready to fight. So if that's you, Revive 2019, get on your feet and let's sing as though we actually